The 1970s were a decade when cinema dared to cross lines no one thought possible. But for every film that shocked audiences, there were others that governments tried to bury forever, censored, banned, or butchered beyond recognition. These exploitation films carried both infamy and influence. Which of them still echo today? And why were so many silenced worldwide? 1. The Last House on the Left, 1972. When Wes Craven's The Last House on the Left premiered, it came disguised as a low-budget revenge thriller. What audiences encountered instead was a raw, nerve-shattering descent into brutality. Critics were stunned, some calling it the death of cinema, others hailing it as a daring new frontier. Yet censors worldwide recoiled, branding it unfit for public release. In Britain, the film was famously banned under the Video Nasties list, sparking furious debates over whether movies could corrupt morality. Versions that survived censorship were slashed to ribbons, sometimes cutting nearly half an hour of footage. Ironically, these edits made the narrative incomprehensible, ensuring the film's notoriety grew even stronger. Behind the scenes, Craven, then a former humanities professor, was deliberately pushing boundaries. He wanted to hold a mirror to the violent, saturating news reports of the Vietnam War. But instead of sparking thoughtful reflection, his film became synonymous with scandal. It was screened at midnight shows in America, whispered about by teens who dared to seek out bootleg VHS tapes. Though maligned in its time, Last House on the Left is now regarded as a milestone in horror cinema, proof that sometimes what gets censored only becomes more powerful. What was once condemned as filth now stands as a chilling reminder of how far art will go to challenge society's comfort zones. 2. Cannibal Holocaust, 1979. Few films carry the legend or the stigma of Ruggero Deodato's Cannibal Holocaust. Marketed as a pseudo-documentary, it shocked audiences so thoroughly that its director was arrested in Italy on suspicion of murder. Authorities were convinced that the disturbing imagery was real. Deodato had to summon his actors to court to prove they were still alive. Banned in more than 50 countries, including the UK, Australia, and Norway, the movie became a symbol of what censorship feared most, that fiction could look too much like truth. While American exploitation was about revenge or crime, Italian cinema of the era dove into sensational shock. The film's blend of found footage and faux journalistic style predated the Blair Witch Project by 2 decades. Controversy swirled not only over its violent scenes, but also over its supposed commentary on Western exploitation of indigenous cultures. Critics were torn. Is it exploitation masquerading as critique, or critique wrapped in exploitation? The blurred line became its legacy. Smuggled copies circulated underground, where it gained cult status. To this day, debates rage. Is it the most disturbing exploitation film ever made, or one of the most misunderstood? Cannibal Holocaust forces us to confront a question no censor could ever silence. How much horror can art reveal before it becomes unbearable? 3. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. At the peak of the 1970s, few films embodied the extremes of exploitation more than Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS. Shot cheaply in Canada on leftover sets from Hogan's Heroes, the film took the Nazi-exploitation subgenre to shocking new lows and heights of infamy. Starring Diane Thorne as the sadistic Commandant Ilsa, the film became infamous worldwide. While some dismissed it as tasteless trash, others were drawn to its outrageous audacity. Censors across Europe and Australia banned it outright, declaring it beyond the pale of acceptable art. Yet, the bans only fueled its legend. Behind the camera, the producers knew exactly what they were doing, using scandal as marketing. Posters were plastered with warnings of too shocking to be shown, ensuring audiences would seek it out in underground theaters. Bootlegs thrived, passed hand to hand as forbidden fruit. What's striking is that despite its crude execution, the film captured something undeniable about exploitation cinema, its hunger to provoke. By blending real historical trauma with sensationalized fantasy, Ilsa became a lightning rod for debates about taste, morality, and censorship. Even today, it remains banned in some countries, yet it has carved out a strange cult following. For better or worse, Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, proves that once a film is branded forbidden, its notoriety can outlive even its shock value. 4. Salon Kitty, 1976. Tinto Brass's Salon Kitty was an Italian-German production that blurred the lines between art film and exploitation spectacle. Inspired by real events during World War II, the film dramatized the story of Nazi officers using a high-class brothel for espionage and manipulation. At its surface, it looked like another sensational Nazi-exploitation flick, but its pedigree complicated matters. The cast featured respected actors like Ingrid Thulin and Helmut Berger, lending the film an unsettling legitimacy. The production was lavish compared to most exploitation films, with elaborate set design and meticulous period detail. But that only made the controversial elements hit harder. Censors across Europe pounced, banning or heavily cutting the movie, arguing that it desecrated history by mingling political tragedy with lurid storytelling. In Germany, where sensitivities around World War II were particularly raw, it was treated as cultural poison. Even in Italy, critics accused Brass of exploiting history for cheap thrills. Yet beneath the scandal, the film reflected Brass's trademark satirical edge. He wasn't simply shocking for shock's sake, he was skewering authoritarian hypocrisy through grotesque exaggeration. Salon Kitty became part of a cycle of films that were too polished to dismiss entirely, yet too provocative to ever escape censorship. Today, it stands as an uncomfortable reminder that even when wrapped in glamour and artistry, exploitation cinema could still trigger worldwide outrage. Its legacy is one of contradiction, both an infamous trash classic and a provocative work of political satire. 5. Thriller, A Cruel Picture, 1973. Also known as They Call Her One Eye, this Swedish revenge tale directed by Bo Arne Vibenius became one of the most notorious grindhouse imports of the 1970s. Marketed with shocking posters and lurid promises, Thriller gained a reputation as the most banned movie ever made. And for a time, that label wasn't an exaggeration. The story followed a mute young woman, brutalized and forced into degradation, who eventually fights back with brutal efficiency. What set it apart from other revenge thrillers of the era was its raw, almost clinical depiction of cruelty. Sweden, known for its strict censorship boards, immediately condemned it. The film was pulled from circulation in its home country, then banned across much of Europe and the US. Yet, ironically, its reputation only grew as it was whispered about among cult audiences. When bootlegs began circulating in America, it became a staple at underground screenings. Years later, Quentin Tarantino would cite Thriller as a key inspiration for Kill Bill, particularly in its stylistic use of the eye patch and slow-motion vengeance. Behind the scenes, Vibenius claimed he was making the roughest movie ever produced, specifically to provoke. The result was so extreme that it was seized, censored, and sometimes destroyed. But in surviving prints, audiences saw not just exploitation, but a strange sort of empowerment narrative buried inside its brutality. Thriller, A Cruel Picture remains both infamous and influential, a film so censored it became impossible to suppress. Its legacy endures not through what was cut, but through what audiences could never forget. 6. Blood-Sucking Freaks, 1976. When Joel M. Reed's Blood-Sucking Freaks hit grindhouse theaters, even seasoned exploitation fans recoiled. It was promoted with outrageous taglines promising depravity beyond comprehension. And for once, the marketing didn't exaggerate. The film's grotesque blend of horror and sadism was so extreme that it quickly became one of the most censored exploitation films of the decade. In the US, the film faced backlash from women's rights groups, who protested theaters that dared to screen it. The Motion Picture Association condemned it, forcing Reed to constantly re-edit in order to secure distribution. Overseas, censors in Britain, Australia, and Canada moved swiftly to ban it outright. Even video distributors were hesitant. Copies were seized in raids, further elevating its notoriety. Despite being dismissed as bottom-of-the-barrel exploitation, Blood-Sucking Freaks developed a cult following. Among fans who sought out cinema's most extreme taboos, midnight screenings thrived on its reputation, with audiences daring each other to sit through its relentless imagery. What's fascinating is how the controversy sustained the film far beyond what its low budget should have allowed. Without censorship, blood-sucking freaks might have faded into obscurity. Instead, its reputation as the film they didn't want you to see became its ticket to infamy. Today, it remains one of the most infamous titles in exploitation history, less remembered for its content than for the worldwide outrage it provoked. In the end, censorship didn't erase it. It only guaranteed its eternal place in grindhouse legend. 7. Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Few films from the 1970s carry as much infamy as Pier Paolo Pasolini's Salo, or the 120 Days of Sodom. Released in 1975, it instantly became one of the most censored films of all time. Loosely inspired by the Marquis de Sade and set during the final days of Mussolini's fascist regime, Salo wasn't marketed as an exploitation film, but its relentless imagery placed it squarely in the same category for censors worldwide. The film depicted a group of young captives subjected to the perversions and cruelty of corrupt aristocrats, framed as an allegory for fascist power. Pasolini, a provocative intellectual and political filmmaker, insisted it was a symbolic critique, yet audiences and critics in Italy were horrified. The film was pulled from theaters and in several countries, such as the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. It was outright banned. Even when released decades later, it often appeared only in censored versions. Controversy followed not just on screen, but off it. Pasolini himself was murdered shortly after completing the film, a brutal killing that added to the aura of mystery and fear surrounding Salo. Some argued that his death was linked to the political themes of the movie, while others saw it as tragic coincidence. Despite its heavy censorship, Salo found a life in underground screenings, where intellectuals and cinephiles debated whether it was art or obscenity. For many, it became the ultimate example of a film so controversial that censors tried to erase it from existence. Yet today, critics acknowledge it as a radical, if disturbing, masterpiece, proof that the line between art house cinema and exploitation can sometimes vanish completely. 8. Mark of the Devil, 1970. Released at the dawn of the 1970s, Mark of the Devil quickly became notorious as the most horrifying film ever made. An Austrian-West German production directed by Michael Armstrong, it dramatized 17th-century witch hunts with a level of violence that shocked even seasoned horror fans. Its marketing campaign leaned into the scandal, famously handing out vomit bags at theaters. In Britain, the film was one of the first to earn an X rating, and censors cut heavily into its more graphic sequences. In the United States, the National Catholic Office for Motion Pictures condemned it, while audiences lined up to see the forbidden spectacle. The irony, as always, was that censorship and protest only heightened its appeal. Behind the scenes, the film faced production chaos. Armstrong clashed with producers, who pushed the movie further into exploitation territory. Udo Kier, in one of his earliest starring roles, later admitted he was shocked by how extreme the finished film became. But it was precisely this rawness that cemented its cult reputation. Mark of the Devil went on to be banned or restricted in multiple countries, often lumped into the later video nasties panic of the 1980s. Yet, unlike many of its peers, it benefited from the notoriety. Fans of horror and exploitation still seek it out today, not just for its shock value, but as a case study in how marketing, censorship, and controversy can elevate a film to legend. Even now, the tagline, rated VV for violence, remains one of the most infamous in exploitation history. Mark of the Devil is remembered as a film that dared to be too much, and in being censored, it secured its place as unforgettable. 9. Fight for Your Life, 1977. Robert A. Endelson's Fight for Your Life is one of the most controversial American exploitation films ever made, not because of gore or spectacle, but because of its raw portrayal of racism and violence. Released in 1977, the film shocked audiences so deeply that it was banned outright in Britain for decades, while other countries cut it beyond recognition. The story follows a black family terrorized by three escaped convicts who invade their home. The ringleader unleashes a torrent of racial slurs and humiliations, creating a movie experience that was as verbally violent as it was physically brutal. Censors immediately declared it unfit for public consumption, calling it a nuclear weapon of hate speech. In fact, the British Board of Film Classification refused to even grant it a certificate until 2005, almost 30 years later. Behind the scenes, Endelson had set out to craft a raw, confrontational revenge story in the mold of Last House on the Left and Death Wish. But unlike those films, Fight for Your Life didn't disguise its ugliness. It rubbed audiences' faces in prejudice and degradation, forcing them to endure what many considered unbearable. Ironically, the very thing that censors tried to suppress, the film's shocking racial content, became the reason it developed a cult following. Grindhouse theaters in the U.S. leaned into the controversy, marketing it as the film they tried to ban. Bootleg tapes circulated globally, whispered about as one of the most offensive movies ever made. Today, Fight for Your Life is studied less for its craftsmanship than for what it represents. The extreme edge of 1970s exploitation, where provocation became the entire point. It remains one of the clearest examples of how censorship both suppressed and immortalized a film at the same time. 11SS, Experiment Camp, 1976. If there's one exploitation film whose title alone ignited controversy, it's SS Experiment Camp, an Italian production directed by Sergio Garrone. Released in 1976, it quickly became infamous as part of the Nazi-exploitation cycle, a lurid subgenre that combined World War II iconography with sensational shock value. But this one went further, ensuring its place among the most banned films of the era. When it arrived in the UK, it was immediately seized by authorities and placed on the infamous Video Nasties list during the 1980s moral panic. Censors argued that the movie desecrated history, exploiting Nazi imagery for cheap thrills and crossing the line between grotesque fantasy and real atrocity. The British press even used its poster, a shocking image of a woman suspended in a laboratory tank, as a rallying cry against violent media. What's striking is that, behind the lurid packaging, the film was relatively tame compared to its legend. But the power of marketing was everything. Garrone and his producers deliberately pushed scandal, knowing censorship would act as free publicity. The gamble worked. While banned in Britain and parts of Europe, it thrived on the underground market, with fans hunting down contraband VHS copies. The controversy gave SS Experiment Camp a mythic status far beyond its actual cinematic quality. By the time it was re-released decades later, it was already burned into film history as one of the most censored movies of its time. In hindsight, the film demonstrates how exploitation cinema didn't just provoke censors, it depended on them. By trying to silence SS Experiment Camp, authorities ensured its immortality as a forbidden relic of 1970s grindhouse excess. 12. Snuff, 1976. Sometimes a movie becomes legendary, not for what it contains, but for what people believe it contains. That was the case with Snuff, a 1976 exploitation film that triggered one of the most infamous censorship scandals of the decade. Originally shot in Argentina under the title Slaughter, the film sat unreleased until American producers Michael and Roberta Findlay rebranded it as Snuff. To exploit rising fears about underground snuff films, movies supposedly showing real murders, they added a new ending depicting what looked like an on-camera killing of an actress. The marketing was shameless. Posters asked, "The film that could only be made in South America, where life is cheap." The gimmick worked. Outraged audiences and protest groups demanded the film's ban, believing it depicted an actual murder. Police investigated screenings, and moral crusaders decried it as proof that cinema had crossed a line of no return. In reality, the infamous murder sequence was staged with cheap effects. No one was harmed, but by the time the truth came out, the damage and the publicity was done. Snuff became a box office hit on the grindhouse circuit, fueled entirely by censorship scares and tabloid headlines. The film itself is largely forgettable, but the scandal surrounding it was seismic. It cemented the myth of snuff films in popular culture and demonstrated how powerful rumors could be in fueling censorship. Even today, snuff is remembered as a hoax that terrified governments, inflamed activists, and forever linked the word snuff with cinematic taboo. A film that was almost nothing without controversy became one of the most censored titles of the 1970s, proving that sometimes the legend matters more than the reality. 13. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. If there is one film that has carried the torch of controversy longer than almost any other exploitation title, it is Mir Zarchi's I Spit on Your Grave. Released in 1978 under the more provocative grindhouse title Day of the Woman, it was immediately branded as one of the most shocking, repellent movies ever made. The premise followed a young woman who, after enduring horrific violence, enacts a brutal revenge against her tormentors. Unlike other revenge thrillers, the camera lingered with unflinching focus, giving the film an almost documentary-style rawness. For many censors, this was beyond endurance. In Britain, it became one of the most infamous video nasties, banned for decades and only released in heavily cut versions. Australia and several European countries followed suit, declaring it unfit for public consumption. What fueled the controversy was the ambiguity of Zarchi's intent. Some argued the film was exploitative trash designed to shock audiences into buying tickets. Others, however, claimed it was a raw feminist statement, an uncompromising revenge narrative where the victim seizes absolute power. The polarizing reactions only added to its legend. Roger Ebert famously gave it one of the harshest reviews of his career, calling it a vile bag of garbage. Yet decades later, it was reevaluated by some critics as an unpolished but daring work that reflected the anxieties of its time. Quentin Tarantino even cited it as an influence, proof that forbidden films often spark new generations of filmmakers. I Spit on Your Grave stands today as one of the clearest examples of a movie defined by its censorship. Every ban, every protest, every seizure of its reels only amplified its notoriety. It remains a haunting reminder that exploitation films often thrive most when they are forced underground. 14. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. Though remembered today as a horror classic, Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre was once considered too extreme for audiences around the world. Released in 1974, it was initially sold as a true story, an audacious marketing ploy that added to its myth. Audiences expecting a traditional slasher were instead confronted with a sweaty, nerve-shattering nightmare that felt almost real. Censors immediately took notice. The UK refused to classify it for years, leaving it effectively banned until the late 1990s. In Australia, it was banned outright in multiple states. Even in the United States, many theaters pulled it after protests, labeling it an obscenity masquerading as cinema. Ironically, the film contained far less blood than its reputation suggested. Its power came from atmosphere, sound, and suggestion. Behind the scenes, the production itself mirrored the nightmare on screen. Actors endured sweltering heat, rotting animal carcasses on set, and grueling 16-hour days. Gunnar Hansen, who played Leatherface, later revealed that the chainsaw he wielded was real, and in at least one scene, he came terrifyingly close to injuring himself. Despite censorship, or perhaps because of it, Texas Chainsaw became one of the most profitable independent films of the decade. It terrified audiences, inspired countless imitators, and changed horror cinema forever. Today it sits in the Library of Congress as a preserved classic, but in the 1970s, it was considered so dangerous it had to be silenced. Its journey from banned, exploitation to cultural treasure shows how censorship can't erase genuine innovation. It can only delay recognition. 15. A Clockwork Orange, 1971. At the top of the list sits Stanley Kubrick's A Clockwork Orange, a film that wasn't just censored, it was voluntarily withdrawn by its own director. Released in 1971, it shocked audiences with its dystopian vision of ultra-violence, youth rebellion, and psychological control. Malcolm McDowell's portrayal of Alex became instantly iconic, both magnetic and repulsive. In Britain, the film initially received an X rating, but soon after its release, Kubrick himself pulled it from circulation. Why? After reports of real-life crimes supposedly inspired by the film, and after receiving threats against his family, Kubrick demanded that it be banned in the UK. For nearly 3 decades, A Clockwork Orange could not be shown legally in Britain, not until after Kubrick's death in 1999. Elsewhere, it faced its own censorship battles. Ireland and South Africa banned it outright, while the US grappled with protests and outrage. Yet the controversy only amplified its power. Critics debated whether it glorified violence or condemned it, and universities screened it in secret as a forbidden text. Behind the scenes, Kubrick relished the chaos. He had crafted the film as a warning about state power and social conditioning, not as an endorsement of violence. But once released, it took on a life of its own, transforming into the ultimate dangerous movie. Today, A Clockwork Orange is hailed as a masterpiece, its imagery etched permanently into film history. But in the 1970s, it was censored more thoroughly than any other mainstream release, proof that even genius could be deemed too dangerous for audiences. The 1970s were a battleground where censorship clashed with artistic daring. These exploitation films, whether reviled, banned, or misunderstood, proved that cinema's power lies in its ability to disturb as much as entertain. Which of these titles would you dare to watch today? Comment below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.